Welcome to BFSI classes, Domain Business Correspondent, Chapter Introduction to Banking. Indian banking system was earlier controlled by private money lenders, but nationalization of SBI in 1955 and nationalization of other 21 public sector banks in two phases in the years 1969 and 1980 strengthened the banking system in India. Later, in 1991-92, the liberalization in banking sector opened a new window to Indian financial system. Now, let us define the banking in India. The definition of the business of banking has been given in the Banking Regulation Act 1949. According to Section 5C of the Banking Regulation Act, a banking company is a company which transacts the business of banking in India. Further, Section 5B of the Banking Regulation Act defines banking as accepting for the purpose of lending or investment of deposits of money from the public, repayable on demand or otherwise, and withdrawable by check, draft, order, or otherwise. This definition implies three facts. First one, maintaining deposit account including current account. Second one, issue and pay checks. Third one, collect checks for the bank's customers. That means banks acting for these three purposes. Now, we have to look into the structure of banking system in India. At the topmost level, RBI acts as apex body of the Indian banking system. Under RBI, there are scheduled banks and non-scheduled banks, and for the time being, we are going to discuss about scheduled banks only. Scheduled banks are those banks obey the rules and regulations of RBI Act 1934. These regulations include paid up capital not less than Rs 5 lakh and listed in the second schedule of RBI Act 1934. That means a bank is called a scheduled bank when it has a paid up capital not less than Rs 5 lakh and it is listed in the second schedule of the RBI Act 1934. Scheduled banks comprised scheduled commercial banks and scheduled cooperative banks. Scheduled commercial banks are of four types: public sector banks, private sector banks, foreign banks, and regional rural banks. Public sector banks include nationalized banks and State Bank of India Group. Private banks are of two types: old private sector banks and new private sector banks. Let us take these one by one. First one, public sector banks. Public sector banks are scheduled banks listed in the second schedule of the RBI Act 1934. They also have a more than 50% share held by Government of India. As of 1st April 2020, there are 12 public sector banks in India. Private sector banks. Private sector banks are those follow the regulations in the RBI Act 1934. As contradictory to the public sector banks, a major share, that is more than 50% of private sector banks, are held by private individuals and corporates. At present, there are 22 private sector banks in India. Third one, foreign banks. Foreign banks are those banks which are headquartered at abroad and present in India. Abu Dhabi Commercial Bank, BNP Paribas, HSBC Bank are some of the examples of foreign banks in operation in India. Regional rural banks. These are localized banks specialized in rural sector. All regional rural banks are jointly owned by state government, central government, and a sponsor bank. RRBs were formed in 1976 based on Regional Rural Bank Act 1976. RRBs provide banking facilities to rural and semi-urban areas. It also carrying out government operations like disbursement of wages of MGNREGA workers, distribution of pension, etc. Cooperative banks. Cooperative banks are intended to provide banking services for semi-urban areas. Normally, cooperative banks are heterogeneous in nature. They differ as per their local requirements. All cooperative banks except rural cooperative banks are regulated by RBI under Banking Regulation Act 1949. Rural cooperative banks are subject to the Cooperative Societies Act 1912. Now, let us go into the details of various functions of commercial banks. There are three functions that every commercial banks perform. They are accepting deposits, lending money, and remittance of funds. Now, we can look at each one by one. Accepting deposits. One of the primary functions of every commercial bank is accepting deposits. Deposits consist of demand deposits and time deposits or fixed deposits. Demand deposits are those deposits which are payable on demand by the customer. Fixed deposits are those deposits with fixed time period and can only be paid to customer after the maturity period. This can be explained in detail in the following chapter. Second function is lending money. Second primary function of every commercial bank is lending money. There are various types of loans available with the commercial banks, which can be discussed later in detail. Normally, rate of interest on loans will be higher than rate of interest on deposits. Third function, fund remittance. Fund remittance refers to the various online fund transfer schemes provided by commercial banks to its customers. Customers can send money from one account to another account through various channels like NEFT, RTGS, IMPS, UPI, etc. Now the final topic is how banks earn profit. Banks earn profit by increasing the net interest margin. Net interest margin is the difference between lending rate received and deposit rate paid out. That means, as much as the interest received from the loans is higher than the interest paid out to customers, banks enjoy a high profit. As this positive difference reduces, the profit of the bank becomes reduced. That's for all. We can look at another chapters, another lectures. Thank you.